The Speaker, I can tell you that both initiatives will deliver more than what that last government attempted to when, for instance, they put out a $1 billion infrastructure scheme.
Tēnā koutou, I'm Selwyn Manning and this is A View from Afar. Today, political scientist Paul Buchanan and I will examine whether there is in reality such a thing as foreign policy independence in today's world and how in some way should we define this. And specifically, Paul and I will examine the following questions. What does it mean to be foreign policy independent and what would independence look like? How is foreign policy independence different from foreign policy autonomy and flexibility? And what factors inhibit or constrain foreign policy independence, both in a domestic and international settings? And in an independent world, can foreign policy independence be a realistic objective? And finally, we will look at foreign policy independence. Is it possible for small states in this era, and if it ever was? And conversely, do great powers really exercise independence in their foreign affairs? Before we cross to Paul, remember here's an invitation to those who are joining us live. Do feel free to interact with us while we are live right now. And you can do so, and we highly recommend that you do so via YouTube, and the links are in all of the platforms. But if you wish to, you can on Facebook too. It's just that YouTube is performing in that way better at this stage. But remember that if you do make comments or lodge questions, your interaction may be included in this broadcast. So let's cross to Paul, who is waiting online right now, and we'll get in and deep dive into this amazingly interesting and evaluative issue. Tēnā koe e ho. How are you, Paul?
I'm very good, Selwyn. How are things down in the Hawke's Bay?
Not too bad. A bit of pollen I'm not too used to, and so I'm a bit husky in the old voice and kind of sucking on Ventolin or something like that, but we'll get through that. And hopefully I don't cough down the microphone. I'll turn the audio off if I feel that urge. But we're here and we've got an amazing issue to discuss, haven't we, Paul? And this is one I'll just bring up on the screen. It's one that's based on, there's my videos. It was based on an article that you wrote and distributed via the 36parallel.com website. That is your company's 36 Parallel Assessments organ. So it's an interesting one, and it's titled, just for those that are listening here and can't see on screen, is New Zealand's foreign policy independent and related issues. Now, Paul has framed this, obviously, and I won't speak to these points because you can, Paul, but Paul has framed this within a New Zealand context, but it has relevancy, and he takes us through this, and will do today, into the global setting as well, and really gets back to the thing that in a multilateral and bilateral and even a superpower type of led world like we've had in the past, is independence possible for even those big powers? Now, Paul, back to you. I'd just like to hand it over to you to take us through in a logical sequence of your thinking, so that people that are listening and watching can evaluate the arguments as we go through.
Very good, yes, and thanks for Returning to this topic, I think I should set the stage by outlining how I came to start thinking about this. I mean, I've been thinking about this subject for quite a while, but here's what precipitated or prompted that article. Um, since I've been in New Zealand, I've heard about New Zealand punching above its weight in international relations, which is questionable, but having an independent, and at one time they actually said autonomous foreign policy. And having worked in the U.S. foreign policy establishment, I always thought, boy, that's an interesting concept. And maybe it's due to the fact we're down here in the South Pacific. For a long time, no one wanted to mess with us. I mean, who knows? Well, a couple months ago, one of the international relations pundits here in New Zealand parroted the line that New Zealand has an independent foreign policy. And it was referring to something that the foreign minister had said, because the government says that all the time. We have this independent foreign policy. And I'll be honest with you, Selwyn, I thought about it, and I thought, that's a load of rubbish. It's a load of rubbish. We have no independence. But
Is
I
it too
thought, okay,
broad or something when you take us down into the definitions? Is that kind of statement too broad to be accurate and truthful?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's an aspirational goal rather than a practicable goal. I think it's a mantra amongst the foreign policy elites in New Zealand to make themselves feel good, especially when they engage in contradictory foreign policy behavior. See, it explains away a multitude of sins. But here's the deal, we have to start with, how do you define independence in foreign policy? And what I did in that article, again, I'm working through things. I'm not going to turn around and call something rubbish without an argument, that justifies that characterization. And so I thought, okay,
we'll, as we go through, and I've already got comments there, we'll pick away at you and challenge you on these things.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
The body of your work, gives you the opportunity that you've done in this space to respond, and it'll be a fascinating thing to see where we end up. So I just wanted to add that in for the listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. That's it'd be my pleasure to do a back and forth. But anyway, so how do we define independence in foreign policy? Well, I'd say that you have the unconstrained ability to formulate and implement foreign policy initiatives without fear of retribution, constraint, retaliation, or even favor. You just go out and do it. And I thought, okay, that's not what's happening. And the reason it's not happening is both external and internal. Externally, New Zealand and other countries, I'll argue down the road, are not independent because they're inserted in what I call a lattice work of international relationships. Think about New Zealand. We belong to the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization. We belong to the TPPA, Multilateral Trade Agreement. We have a bilateral trade agreement with China. We have a security agreement with Australia. We belong to the Pacific Island Forum. We belong to the Antarctic Treaty. We're a non-NATO partner nation. We have all these external relationships, and with them come responsibilities as well as rights and privileges. So we're not operating in an unfettered fashion out in the world. We're in fact inserted in this multitude of relationships. Moreover, internally, we have what is known as the second image effect. That is, the domestic sources of foreign policy. And in New Zealand's case, we are heavily influenced by agricultural interests, dairy in particular, because our trade is so dependent on it. 50% plus of New Zealand's GDP comes from trade. Of that, a third is trade with the People's Republic of China. That constrains us, but it also influences the way the foreign policy elites think. Then we have both governmental and non-governmental actors who want to influence foreign policy. For example, the New Zealand Defence Forces agitate all the time for closer relations with the United States and Great Britain. They want to be, serious strategic partners. On the other hand, human rights organizations, civil society organizations want us to exercise principle in foreign policy, condemn the PRC for the treatment of Uyghurs. All these groups influence the shape of New Zealand's foreign policy at any given time. But again, the trade lobby, and they are lobbies, has disproportionate influence over New Zealand's foreign policy. So,
and just as we move on from that, over the various decades, you can get a sense, and I'm speaking from a person that has covered politics within the New Zealand context and how New Zealand is positioned around the world in some respects. And you can see, I'm not saying irrespective of what party is in power, but the influences of priority and value settings of various parties that may be in executive office at any given time. And I would suggest that back in the 90s, the influence of the National Party and its trade-led policies saw the foreign affairs diplomatic squad being dominated by a trade-first interest, and the promotion sets for those that were working within the foreign affairs ministries and their postings overseas often would be advanced on the basis of their trade talents. And so we would see perhaps an imbalance within the New Zealand context where our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade is all within the same umbrella. You get another party that may come in, like for example the Helen Clark-led party of Labour in the 2000s, where it aligned with the then Alliance Party, which had strong foreign relation ideals relating to pacifism and other elements. And you saw the build-up of talents within the diplomatic side, the foreign affairs engagement on diplomacy, and also New Zealand's Defence Force developing a response to not necessarily blue helmet peacekeeping, but assistance in those areas. And certainly, working in a way where it would look at a multilateral setting before it leapt into a bilateral kind of thing, like the Iraq invasion that US led, where Australia went in but New Zealand didn't. So, Paul, I'm just pulling back because we see an oscillation, don't we, within the foreign affairs context. And I just wanted to lay that tapestry down a little bit before you go through this next part.
No, very, very good. It also anticipates something I'm going to bring up. I will point out that in the previous national government, I actually wrote, in fact, when we first met, I was writing along these lines that in New Zealand, everything passes through the prism of trade. And that was certainly true for the national government. And that was first and foremost. But you're right, there is an oscillation, but it leads to contradictions. And I'll give you an example. We trade with Saudi Arabia. We're in the live meat trade. We trade with the People's Republic of China. And yet we say that on the international stage, we are champions of human rights and dignity. Well, that's not apparent in our trade relationship. In fact, it's quite a contradiction in that relationship. Then on the other hand, we're part of the Five Eyes signals intelligence gathering network. That gives us great privileges, in my opinion. But on the other hand, it's not like we can share our secrets with the People's Republic of China, especially since they're the main target of Five Eyes espionage. So I would say, look, the way to reconcile this is to think of New Zealand foreign policy, and by extension, those of other small states, again, we'll get to that in a second, as being flexible based on constrained or bounded autonomy. We're not independent, but we are flexible. And the issue with flexibility is not to be contradictory. And it works like this. Again, we're flexible not so much because we consciously, decide to go issue by issue and whatnot, although there is some of that. But think of it this way, that lattice work of relationships, treaties, pacts, all that sort of stuff. Some are more restrictive than others. Some are work on self-binding principles, that is, voluntary principles. Others are mandatory. You sign up to a deal and you have contractual obligations. So given that this assortment of relationships have varying degrees of compulsion in them, then we have flexibility. And that makes sense when you think of that New Zealand is in fact the champion of a rules and norms-based international order. And there's a good reason for that. Where there's rules and norms, all actors' behavior are constrained by those universal rules. That allows New Zealand to move flexibly rather than fear the pressures of bigger states. So it makes sense to me that if not independent, New Zealand can exercise flexibility based on this constrained economy. We're not completely autonomous in our decision making, again, for the reasons that we've just elaborated. But on the other hand, we do have a degree of autonomy in our decision making, and that's been seen over the years. And so I think that the best way to think of it is give up on the mantra of independence because, again, among other things, we're in a highly interdependent world and focus on having flexibility. And I would say that for New Zealand, given what we say we are, the two things that should guide us as foreign policy principles should be principled when possible, pragmatic when necessary, right? So idealistic when we can be champions of human rights, and then realistic, and I'm a realist when necessary. Now,
So look on that,
go ahead.
Because you'll pick up where you're going with that as soon as I've finished on this. Yeah. So within this, we've seen most recently, a commitment maybe 12 months ago by the Jacinda Ardern-led New Zealand government to have a position where our major trading partner, the People's Republic of China, would ideally understand where New Zealand is coming from with respect to where it voices concerns about human rights abuses that are occurring within China or in other places and other trade relationships that we're having as well. And that at the bilateral meeting that Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and Xi Jinping, the president of the People's Republic of China, the chair, where he basically accepted that and expressed a respect for where New Zealand was coming from. Now, it wasn't given away what they discussed behind the closed doors of that bilateral meeting, but it was made clear by Jacinda Ardern that she addressed some of those issues, but within a context of respect, and then moved to common ground. So we can see, I suppose, from that situation that there's an element of independence from the point of view of we feel an obligation as a small Pacific state to express our view of what we are seeing, and it's a concern. Don't be offended by this. It would be wrong for us not to put that down. Let's get on with the business of trade. That's the pragmatism on that latter part, I would imagine, which is in contrast to perhaps when the Liberals were in power in Australia, where Canberra, its capital city, was grossly at odds with China. China clearly felt that Australia was doing the bidding of its adversary, the United States, under the Trump administration's influence. And the retaliatory responses of the People's Republic of China were often, destructive, weren't they, in many respects? And you and I in these programs have canvassed that. But I'll just pull back and I'll hand it back to you. Is that an example of flexibility, of placing values and then getting on to the pragmatic elements of let's get down to the business of making this trade relationship work better for both?
Yeah, I have two answers to that. The first one is the small countries like New Zealand, you always worry if you bring up human rights with the PRC, in our specific bilateral instance, the PRC can retaliate economically and destroy the New Zealand economy if it wanted to. Again, we're so dependent on them. And so you have to figure out a way to present to them your principles before you can get on to business. And a way to do that is, I won't say you hide behind, but you use international organizations, let's say the International Labor Organization, to demand that in the trade relationships there be child protection laws, fair wage clauses, what the ILO represents. And the ILO is recognized by 160 states. So it's an international convention. Say to the Chinese, in these areas, we'd like to adhere to ILO standards or World Health Organization standards. And that should not interfere with the business of going about business. The second part, it reminds me of something that I witnessed a while ago. The listeners may not know this, but I've written a couple of books about comparative labor relations and labor state relations. And during the research of one of the books is about Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil after the democracies came back in the 80s. So I was studying how you restore a democratic labor relation system after military dictatorships. And so that's why I was there. I was watching, I literally sat in on a collective bargaining session between the Uruguayan Main Labor Federation and the Business Association. Okay, so, the apex negotiators on either side. And it was hilarious for a number of reasons. The business guys came in their limousines. The Ministry of Labor official who invited me to watch this said, "Oh, Pablo, come over here. Look out the window. Here's the labor delegation." And I look out, and 6 guys get out of a Fiat 1500, which, to say the least, is a small car. They all pile out of this car. That's the labor leadership. They all come up. And here's how it goes. And here's why this is relevant to our conversation. They open the proceedings, they shake hands and everything. And so the minister says, "Okay, the labor, you could represent, tell us what you want." The main guy, who was this 80-year-old communist, gets up and goes, "What we want is the destruction of the capitalist system, imperialism, and all oppression from the..." And it goes off on this crazed Marxist rant. And as he's winding down, and of course the business guys are like, "Yowza," and he goes, "But if we cannot achieve that, then we like a 5% wage increase across the board. Thank you very much." And so he opens up with this militant, it was a beautiful rant. He could have been Lenin. But then he comes back, and he had those business guys sitting back on their heels. They're like, "Holy moly, we're going to die here." And then he goes, "But we'll settle for a 5% wage increase." That's more or less what New Zealand can do. Say, our principles demand that we address this issue on a bilateral or a multilateral level. But we have to be pragmatic. We're a trade-dependent country. So you are aware of our concerns. We are trying to frame our concerns in ways that multilateral organizations would agree with. So it's just not us alone. And now we can proceed to the business at hand.
I just put to you on that the response from China in some ways reflects, from its point of view, an understanding that New Zealand's speaking with an independent voice. It's not the mouthpiece of its adversary, perhaps, on these positions. Is that an independence?
No, that's flexibility. That's, what we're doing is, they know that we're part of Five Eyes. They know that we have a Western-centric, a liberal Western-centric view of the world. We're not going to become a strategic ally of China anytime soon. They know all of that. But what we are demonstrating to them is that if we do have strings attached to us, they're very, very long and loose, right? The master, the puppet master is not getting us to dance at his command. And by puppet master, I'm thinking mostly of the United States, but the Western alliance. And so in the measure that we show that flexibility, I think that the pragmatists in the People's Republic of China, and elsewhere for that matter, can live with it.
Now, there might be an element of history here too. Sorry, David Mooring, for example, who's a regular commentator in our program here, and I'm just bringing it up on screen for those that are watching. I'll read it out for those who are listening. David Mooring says here, "If independent foreign policy is such a myth, how has New Zealand retained its nuclear-free policy over these years?" I just added that last few words back to David's quote here. "New Zealand seems to wield disproportionate independent political clout by sticking to actual moral positions." So it's right and key to what we're saying. Does that kind of history of New Zealand embarking on, led by David Longy all those years back into the 1980s, does that give New Zealand a degree of perceived independence, of having a history where it stood at great consequence to itself, away from those global powers like the United States and led global powers by the United States, but also the ANZUS Treaty being basically rendered not an issue for New Zealand anymore. We were pushed out of the tent. Thatcher was in power at the time in the UK. David Lange said to me directly in an interview I did when he was retiring that Foreign Affairs, New Zealand's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they didn't even assist him when he went over for his bilateral meetings with Thatcher. He was left basically on his own to prepare for his Oxford Union speech. Now that to me says independence. David Moring's brought up that question. Let's have a look at that and see it within the context of historical influence, of great consequence to a small nation like New Zealand, where it embarked on its own on an anti-nuclear legislative platform. And all these years later, is that acknowledged by big powers like the People's Republic of China, do you think?
No, I don't think so. I actually disagree with David on this one. I don't think we have disproportionate clout at all. I think it's, again, a myth that we make for ourselves so that we in New Zealand, little old New Zealand, we feel good about ourselves. We stood up to the big guys. The reason we got away with it was because we're insignificant. If we were in Central Europe and declared we didn't want nukes, it would be a very different issue. If we were smack in the middle of NATO and we said, oh no, all nukes out of our country, there would be serious repercussions. We don't matter, or at that point, we did not matter strategically. The Russians and the Chinese weren't on our shores. There was nothing to really defend here. And so it was an affordable loss on the part of the United States and Australia for that matter. But you just mentioned it. Even our own foreign affairs types resisted Lange's initiative. So there were domestic constituencies against that. What I would say is it was a brilliant move. I happen to agree with the non-nuclear declaration back in the day. I think at some point we're going to have to reconsider this. But it's another example of flexibility. And I think that we just shouldn't blow too much sunshine up our skirts when it comes to New Zealand's influence in the global arena. We have influence in the Pacific, but it's mostly about our championing outside of the Pacific of the international norm and rules-based order, champion of human rights. I mean, if people look closer, they'll realize that we got problems at home. And so there's a bit of hypocrisy. But I don't think the nuclear question factors in at all. I mean, factors in at all. I'll leave aside the fact that not only was a long time ago in a Cold War era that no longer exists, and there's been advances in technology that, make the idea that you need a nuclear deterrent stationed in the South Pacific somewhat dubious as a proposition. But I think that it is fair to say that that was the first declaration of New Zealand foreign policy flexibility, because we had always been dependent on the UK, then the United States. I mean, really very tightly tied to them. And David Lange, to his credit, said, you know what, on this one, I'm going to step out.
We still living through this period as a young man, it had the impression, in a general sense, of New Zealand standing alone, and there were dire consequences economically that kicked in, and as far as the burgeoning Five Eyes network, Echelon, and all of those others that lived on and bloomed under this perception of New Zealand independence. So I'm talking here undefined independence as a statement. That's what it felt like. It felt like we had stood on our island and said, enough, we're not interested in this anymore, and we were burned by some of the big powers. But if we take this, and I pick up your points here, and that you're saying, think of it as flexibility. If you look at this, you touched on it earlier about aspirational goals, because one of the things that I felt that if you look at over time on a timeline analysis, you can see New Zealand's aspirations of perhaps one day becoming an independent Pacific Island state. Now that comment, and that was used by David Lange many years ago too in the interview, once again in the interview for a feature on his retirement that I did. That is in the context of all of those conventions, the structures of the New Zealand democracy, the New Zealand economy, being an offshoot, an export of Great Britain. And this aspiration of, over time, where would New Zealand go to become independent of that? You know, for example, we've had a change in monarch, change of head of state. We now have the QCs, or the Queen's Councils in the legal context, becoming King's Council. We have a new king basically back in the UK. We have a new head of state. We have that head of state represented by the Governor General here in New Zealand, who is basically the representative of the British monarch. Now, all of those kind of things, if somebody does a misdemeanour in the courts, say is alleged to have committed a crime, they present before the courts, and it will be the Crown versus whoever that person is. Now, all of these types of things are a reminder, perhaps, that New Zealand is not independent in any way within the structures of our democracy, but is an aspirational goal toward becoming independent of that, and whatever that looks like, whether it's constitutional or republicanism, who knows. But is that aspirational goal going to end in independence? Or is it going to end in the same as what we've got, that we're basically flexible from the point of view of having our own voice and our own choices, but within the constraints of non-pragmatic and, you know, being pragmatic, but it's just not independence as when you dig down and define it. It's a long kind of response, Paul, but I just wanted to inject that in.
Yeah, look at it. First of all, I think that this obsession with independence speaks to a New Zealand cultural trait, a cultural trait that, quite frankly, may be a Pakeha trait more than a Maori trait. We want to feel independent. You know, we're small, vulnerable, yet on the one hand, we want to be the guardians of our own destiny. On the other hand, if we answer to a monarchy that's 10,000 miles away from us, and our top government official is appointed by that monarchy over our prime minister, who is freely elected, then of course we're not independent. I think that we have to get independence in our domestic affairs, as in rid ourselves of that monarchy, before we can have full, or we can even aspire to be independent on the international stage. But again, I don't want listeners to think that I think the quest for independence is a bad thing. I am very comfortable with foreign policy flexibility. And that's because I do not think it is possible to be independent in this era, if it ever was. And let me give you a couple examples. As I thought about this, once we agreed that we talk about it on A View from Afar, I went beyond the article that I wrote. And I started thinking about other small states, particularly small democracies, because New Zealand is not as unique as New Zealanders like to think they are. You know, we have unique characteristics and what have you, but I'd hate to say it, but we're not that special. Think of it this way. Uruguay it's inserted in a lattice work of relationships, and yet its security policy is closer to independent than ours is. They don't have alliances in the own region, and they certainly are not allied with the United States.
And New Zealand did export in some way to Uruguay its anti-nuclear positions, didn't it?
I'd have to ask a historian about that. I'm not entirely sure, but it could be. It could be. Uruguay, even now under a right-center government, has always been quite progressive, and maybe they'll take what New Zealand can offer. Another country is Costa Rica. Costa Rica is in a very hot region in the world, incredibly violent region, Central America, and yet they don't have a military. I mean, that's what they're known for, is not having military. They have a very heavily militarized police, but they don't have a military. And they too have an abundance of trade relationships, but exercise a degree of discretion in their relationships. And so I think, okay, some small states seek the shelter of a bigger state's protection. It could be post-colonial in nature. It could be out of a serious sense of pragmatism that they can't do it on their own. I think of some Pacific Island states. But others, which I would call medium small, for lack of a better phrase, have charted flexible courses of action that are not identical to ours here in New Zealand, but which are a policy response on the part of at least some small liberal democracies that is more or less like what New Zealand's doing, although the specifics differ. I should point out that Uruguay is in the process of negotiating a bilateral free trade agreement with the People's Republic of China. And if I was an advisor to the Uruguayan foreign ministry, I'd go, no, don't do it. Hold on. That debt will be called at some point. But then again, I'm not a big fan of the Chinese regime. It seems to me that the best we can do in this day and age, because we are so now highly interdependent, economically, militarily, where we're broken into blocks, certainly culturally. I mean, we got American hip hop and rap is, prevalent in New Zealand. In an interdependent world, I think flexibility is the best course of action. Again, the issue is to not be contradictory. When you talk about human rights and say you're a champion of human rights, and you don't address the issue with the Saudi Arabians, who are now our biggest Middle Eastern trade partner, or the Iranians, that's a contradiction. And contradictions like that are very difficult to resolve without compromising your principles. So again, principled when possible, pragmatic when necessary. You may try to mix it, but it's the flexibility in the foreign policy making that allows you to take specific foreign policy items or issues and address them on their merits rather than be saddled by binding agreements and relationships that prevent you from engaging in certain courses of action. See, we still have a latitude in our approach to sensitive foreign policy issues, but it's not unbounded. It's not, a universe of possibilities. It's, again, a constrained degree of autonomy in that measure. I happen to think flexibility is an honorable thing, that it's an achievable thing, that it doesn't have to be aspirational or a myth. It is, again, practicable. And that's what we should be admitting to. I think our foreign policy elites, and again, this all started with me thinking, the foreign policy elites say this to make themselves feel good. I think we need to give up on saying we're independent and instead come back and say, no, we're flexible. The world is too complex to be independent. The last independent country that I can think of was Albania.
Yeah, I was going to bring up Albania. Independence does not always mean good. It doesn't mean prosperity or progress on economic grounds, social grounds, or anything else. It just means what it means. And it'll be an interesting thing. I mean, I was going to put too, that clearly one of the problems in the Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific region is North Korea. When it sends a missile over the island states of Japan with disregard, it's expressing perhaps independent thought. It's not being supported by the People's Republic of China. It's not supported by anybody else but itself. And obviously it's folly. It's not a good thing if you're going to apply the New Zealand value sets to observing such things. But let's get down into, let's take it out, Paul, to the global space, because there's the element of this question that came from your piece here. And it says, is foreign policy independence possible for a small state in this era? And you've clearly articulated why that's not the case. But conversely, do great powers, and let's include a superpower in this, or regional powers like Russia, do those great powers really exercise independence in their foreign affairs? It's a good question, isn't it? And let you take us through this.
Yeah, I'm glad for the opportunity because, again, this is an evolving thought. So, as listeners will undoubtedly see today, we've been very New Zealand centric because it all started from us thinking about New Zealand. And the short answer is small states can't be independent. They can be flexible. Then I got to thinking about great states, because again, I come out of the beast, the U.S. foreign policy and defense establishment. And quite frankly, I don't think that great states are independent either. But there, it's a little different. There, great states have more responsibilities as a result of global interdependence. They protect smaller states. They engage in relationships that, in some instances, may not benefit them, but which benefit the international community as a whole. And it isn't reduced to the United States. I mean, France has obligations, Germany has obligations. I think that the issue of independence in a multi-layered, complex world such as that exists today is an impossibility. It's just that the nature of flexibility shifts. New Zealand doesn't have major obligations to a host of other nations. We have obligations in the Pacific, but if you really scratch below the surface, we don't. I mean, there's some sort of post-colonial guilt with regards to Samoa and Tonga, to be sure. But if we wanted to, we could give it up to the Chinese. I mean, again, that shows that we're worried about the Chinese along with our Western partners. So we're not acting independently. For greater states, the question is it's more paternalistic. It's more, we have to extend the benefits of our trade to these smaller states to help them develop. We have to extend security guarantees so they're not preyed upon by other states. And so I think there too, to say nothing of the fact that economically, great states are as interdependent as small states are. I mean, again, you just look at any advanced capitalist economy, and that much is true. So I think they are not independent either. It's just the nature of their flexibility and the constraints on their behavior are somewhat different than those of smaller states and even some medium states.
So if we're going to apply that within the global context at the moment from the particular view of conflict, the conflict in Ukraine, what impact can the multilateral setting, the multilateral voice, if you like, have in any way, whether or not it's trade relationship or sanction, or whether or not it's resistance or providing arms to Ukraine to defend, have on what would be perceived as an independent decision on behalf of the Kremlin to invade for whatever purpose?
Well, I mean, that's again, you're offering a lot of insight here. Well, so I'll start with the Kremlin. The Kremlin did this invasion because it thought it could get away with it. It misperceived Western values for Western weakness. Remember, Putin and his crowd see the freedoms of democracy as the Achilles heel of democracy, freedoms of expression, of toleration, that sort of thing. So they miscalculated and they made a move in order to aggrandize themselves, right? Because Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe and all those sort of things. The Russian demographic is slowing, so they need young people. So by annexing the Donbass region, the average age in that region is around 30, much younger than the Russian population. There's all those reasons. But from the Western standpoint, this is not about the Ukraine. Not at all. It could have been any country. It's about the international order. It's about repudiating the aggressive invasion, preemptive invasion of one state by another. Now, the hypocrisies layered into that are multiple. No one needs to remind me of US behavior for a half century. But here, the international community, led by Europeans know Russians. And they're like, if we don't stop it here, he's going to go for more. Or someone else will emulate him. And of course, everybody thinks of China and says if he gets away with it, then China's going to make a move on Taiwan. So we have to stop it here. And what's interesting And again, here it gets to this whole issue of interdependence. There are pro-Russian Republicans in the United States who want the U.S. to stop aiding and supporting the Ukraine. Now, the U.S. has a very long history of isolationism. Trump played with that quite a bit.
Yeah.
It's the Trump types who are pro-Russian, and now we're finding out that a lot of them are on the Russian payroll. This is going to be among the many revelations that are about to spill out into the public domain. Yes, as in Russian money in their campaign finances through front organizations, the works. And so they're agitating for the United States to withdraw its support. Biden has split the difference. He's sending plenty of weapons, but he's not sending troops because he doesn't want to provoke an armed confrontation with Russia, even though the West will prevail. Russians cannot win a major war against NATO with the United States in it. In fact, they couldn't win with NATO without the United States involved. And so this is about stopping a great power, but a declining power like Russia from from unilateral aggression on a neighbor, hypocrisies notwithstanding. And so the issue is much bigger. The issue is simply, do we support the rules and norms of the international system or do we not? And as you well know, and our listeners undoubtedly know, hypocrisy is the currency of diplomacy. It just is. And so here, even though it's hypocritical, particularly for colonial countries, like France, and then places like the United States, to say that unilateral aggression is bad. The fact is that the international order needs this sort of thing to prevent more of the same. The more
Okay, I get
difficult,
it.
the more difficult you make it for a
Yeah.
country to do what Russia is trying to do, the less likely they or anyone else will try to do it down the road.
So early on in the program, when you were defining this, you placed external and you placed domestic. So let's dig down into the Russian concept here. You've got a Kremlin that has made these decisions. And observations by many, myself included, can see that within the constraints of perhaps muffled voice and all the signals of why a muffled voice among the populace in Russia must be maintained, there need not necessarily be support in the numbers that the global community may perceive from the people inside Russia, the common person. So can you kind of look in within that context and see whether or not the independent decisions, and in this context destructive in many levels, coming from the Kremlin, is out of step with the voice of those domestic elites and domestic non-elites at this particular time and going forward from here? And also, wherever you take this part of the question, what does that mean?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, the second image question was raised with regards to Western liberal democracies, with many constituencies, both in and out of government, all jockeying for position and influencing foreign relations. That's good. Authoritarian regimes are a whole different kettle of fish. And having studied authoritarianism in depth during my academic years, let me point this out. This is something that actually my father and I used to talk about because he was a big businessman in Latin America. America dealt with dictators all the time. The authoritarians present a facade of certainty. That is, they say, what I say goes, that we give the order, people obey. None of this back and forth, arguing endlessly the way democracies do. Now, I say it, you do it. But it's a facade. Behind that facade of certainty is capriciousness, arbitrariness, if that's the right word. The dictator's whims are what make policy because he's shutting out all the feedback loops that would give him honest feedback. He's now surrounding by yes men. This is what's happened in Russia. If you disagreed with Putin's interpretation of history. And I'll be generous here and say this guy really believes that the Ukraine is traditionally, historically part of Russia. Let's say he believes that. Now, maybe there are people, or there were people in his foreign affairs ministry who said, look, that's just not the way it is anymore. I mean, yes, you're talking about history, but in this day and age, Ukraine is not part of Russia and will never be part of Russia. They've got a distinct identity. And so, no, it's not a good idea to try to reclaim them by force because there will be resistance. And then Putin would say, no, but the West is weak. I mean, look at Trump over in the United States. He kisses my ring. We can take them. Look at those Germans. They allow homosexuals to have rights, so on and so forth. And people would push back and say, sir, just because homosexuals have rights doesn't mean that that country is weak. You get purged, okay? You're gone, okay? We don't need to hear that negativity. And so what happens is the feedback loops get cut off. You increasingly get surrounded by yes people who tell you what you want to hear, and then you start making mistakes. Now, repression, and we've talked about this, can be used at home fairly effectively for a while. But then, as I was talking about the Newtonian law last week, but then it begins to wane. Repression against a neighbor, that is, aggression against a neighbor, that's not going to work, okay? That will not work in this modern age. Given there is a NATO, given that the international community, or at least the West, see this move on the Ukraine as a challenge to the international status quo. Again, it's not about Ukraine. It's about the Western-built international liberal order. And so there will be pushback. And the Russians are finding out the hard way what that pushback looks like. And so the second image in authoritarian regimes is distorted. It's like one of those circus mirrors where, you're getting feedback, but it's not in tune with reality. It's not addressing the pragmatic necessities required for rational decision making. And that leads to missteps, mistakes, miscalculations. And in the case of the Russians and the Ukraine, the possibility of defeat and an acceleration of their decline.
It's an interesting concept because, sorry, just on this, it weaves into what you're saying here, that at the UCLA in the United States, there's a Russian academic who specializes in observing the internals, the power internals that accept the benefits in the past of a Putin-led Russia. And he was speaking this week on CNN, and he was talking in these terms, and I'm paraphrasing in a basic sense because it went quite deep, that early on Putin had basically an accepted contract with those on the basis of economic gains. Now, whether or not that was targeted to a few elites or whether or not that, in Thatcher's term, trickled down, is in some ways irrelevant. That contract was there and that was observed, and in his leadership and his regime, if you want to put it that way, was sustained. This seemed to be the key points. He was saying this has changed with this conflict, that the currencies that are in play of benefit for Putin are now human capital as well, that the deaths that Russians are sustaining, or not sustaining, or are losing, are being noted, and that contract amongst elites, that Putin's people can enjoy power on the basis of gain, is eroding. There's an interesting kind of comment from this week's perspective, and it came in probably on the back of whoever has been orchestrating it, but the attacks on military establishments deep inside the Russian territories. So just pulling back from that, do you see these as precursors to a potential change in the future if that contract has been broken, or is the authoritarian fist too strong?
Well, I mean, the vast majority of the oligarchs were not consulted about this move. And yes, Putin takes a cut of all the ill-begotten gains that these oligarchs have accrued. But they weren't consulted, or the majority weren't. Those who were consulted were like the guy who runs the Wagner mercenary group, who's now become one of Putin's closest allies inside of Russia. And he will pay a price if they're defeated because of his close association. But he didn't really run the idea honestly past all his oligarchs, in part because he probably knew that the oligarchs would say that's a bad idea. We make our money in the West, or we hide our money in the West, and there will be sanctions. Unless all of them bought into the idea that the West was too weak to respond, and that's a possibility. I'll defer to Russian experts on that one. If they can say, yeah, look at this was groupthink. Everybody thought the West would fold its hand. Then that's collective insanity. But think of it this way. Here's a parallel. I've been asking myself why the Republican Party in the States is still in the thrall of Donald Trump, still worried by MAGA, and has all these MAGA representatives and what have you, even after the midterm elections. I think this is nuts. The Republican Party needs to get away from this guy and kill him off once and for all, but they won't. And I think, and people say, well, they just fear him because he can galvanize his base. Maybe there's a parallel there with what's going on in Russia, that most of the elites know that this was an ill-begotten venture, but they're too scared to say anything to his face.
So that's exactly the point, isn't it, Paul? Sorry to jump in, but that's exactly it. That the decisions that gave the appearance of independence relating to the invasion that came out of the Kremlin is a facade. It's that independence, that expression of independent decision-making was actually, based on flimsy cards. We haven't seen the consequences of that yet, but it looks likely. This what you said there indicates that in that context, even that independent policy of invasion is a myth.
Well, let's think of it this way. Maybe Putin and his closest advisors believed that they were truly independent and that they could get away with this, and that they would show the world that they could thumb their nose at the Western liberal international order of rules and norms and what have you, and take Ukraine, take it with impunity. Maybe they believe that, but what they're finding out now is that they're not independent, that there are sanctions being levied on them, that there is attrition in their ranks, and it's all coming back home to roost, slower than in the case of a democracy, but inevitable in the case of the autocracy that is known as Putin's Russia. And so if they believe that, they're going to find out the hard way that they were not independent. And now, you know my view on this. This is an acceleration of their decline. They're not coming out of this better than when they went in. And that's the thing, is that had Russia played by the international rules, it would still be a great power with some measure of respect around the world. Now it's not. Okay, it's the diplomatic capital that it has expended negatively in this war effort and defending the war effort, to say nothing of the military capital that it is expended, is going to leave it as a diminished power. I mean, I don't think it's coming out of this as a great power. And it's going to take years for Russia to recover from this. And now, I mean, the blood is in the water. I mean, NATO's been emboldened. They want to take it to the Russians. I mean, who would have thought, well, we started in February talking about the Russians, that anyone in their right mind would talk about retaking Crimea. And yet that's on the table now. And the Ukrainians are getting some support for this. My point simply is the Russians needed to recognize, in spite of Putin's hallucinations, that they're not independent, that they need to think of themselves. There's a phrase in game theory called nested games. And it's sort of like those Russian dolls. right? So you have that, the big game is the macro game. And then inside that game, there are so called nested games, which are like the smaller dolls inside the big doll. They should have thought not so much about the doll in the middle, but about the big game and how that would affect their particular strategic position. Because the way they've played it by ignoring the macro game, they're now saddled themselves with a losing proposition that's going to reduce their stature in that hierarchy of dolls, if you will, to use a bad analogy. So I think that well, I mean, it's so obvious now. The Chinese have slowly pivoted away from Russia. They'll take Russian oil, they'll do all that, but they're slowly giving them the
Yeah.
cold shoulder.
Which
Putin
may
was
be to the
publicly,
benefit of Russia in the end. It might be China as the one that can actually start things. I mean, there's Turkey, obviously, but there's China there
yeah.
potentially. Yeah. Let's wait and see.
Just let's remember. I mean, I'm not predicting anything here, but
Mm.
in the vast open plains of far eastern Siberia, there are incredible mineral and fossil fuel deposits that have been untouched. The Chinese have been looking at those areas for decades, and the Chinese and Russians have gone to war in their common border in those areas or on that plain. Um, I don't see this ending well for Russia with the Chinese slowly pivoting away from them because even if the Chinese continue to support them in a losing proposition, they're not doing this for free. Okay, there's something they want, and that could be preferred exploitation rights. It could even mean ceding territory to China in order to be able to get out of the Ukraine with some semblance of honor. So, like I say, not to beat on the Russians, but this was a gross miscalculation, perhaps born of the mistaken assumption that Russia, as a great power, was well and truly independent and could play by its own rules. As it's finding out, it cannot.
So let's wrap it up, and we'll wrap it up quite quickly. Some of these are questions, Paul. Some of these are comments. They've come in from mostly YouTube, and may or may not require a response because in some ways you've already addressed a lot of them. But I'll bring them up so that people know what the conversation is, and obviously elements of debate that are continuing on. So, for example, here David Mooring is once again he's raised up, and this goes back to about a quarter or a third of the way through our program. By the way, on Five Eyes, which is the spy network, the electronic spy network between the United States, the UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. He says on Five Eyes, where was the heads up to New Zealand from the remaining four of the intelligence they held on the French agents' actions before the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior? What David is referring to there is it appeared that there was intelligence that suggested an attack by France was going to happen on New Zealand soil against the environmental group Greenpeace that was protesting its nuclear tests at Muruwara, and that was perhaps a precursor in some ways to New Zealand desiring independence. So that's my kind of evaluation of where that is. There's another one here. Yep.
Just tell David. Well, David,
Yeah.
the reason there was no heads up is because the other four partners agreed with the French approach. This was a disciplinary action levied on New Zealand for its insolence and allowing the Greenpeace types and whatnot to continue to bother the French about their nuclear testing. That's what it was. It was just a disciplinary agreement or a disciplinary approach to New Zealand for being so insolent and impudent as to encourage Greenpeace to try to humbug the French on their nuclear testing.
David raises a thing. Yeah, David raises an issue here that you touched on. It's about the New Zealand psyche, if you like, or the its own view of its own identity. And he says there's nothing like talking yourself down to help achieve results. He puts that with a question mark. No, he answers himself. Sometimes you need to show confidence, sometimes bigger than the reality, to achieve the small positive steps at all. So what he's talking about there is, and I'll just back up, he's talking about, for example, what we saw in the months after the massacre that took place on New Zealand soil in Christchurch. Where, against the Muslim communities. And he puts in here, in the same way, following Australia, when New Zealand finally banned private ownership of assault weapons, it has a cumulative effect for worldwide gun control. So I think what David is saying there, that hopefully would be the case. And it seems that in some quarters, like, you could see Jacinda Ardern being questioned about how did they achieve gun control to some degree when she was touring the United States earlier this year. Paul, there's a comment here about any comments, and this is right off message, but it might be interesting considering it's right in the current. Any comments on Germany's arrests of the right wing and the Reichsbürger movement? Any comments as we just wrap up, perhaps, and close off the program for this episode?
Yeah, interesting. We may have to address this more fully down the road, but good on the German intelligence services for disrupting this. Apparently, a lot of these guys are ex-military, and they subscribe to the notion that there is a deep state. But here's where it gets interesting. The deep state that these people apparently are referring to is not a German deep state. It's a global deep state, and that is dovetailing into the resurgence of anti-Semitism and, the usual tropes about Jews controlling the world and that sort of thing. These guys think the deep state is a global Jewish-controlled deep state. So they wanted to overthrow the German political regime for their own nationalistic purposes, but they're attached to a global worldview that sees the root cause of the problems in the world today, to believe it once again to be Jews. And we've seen that in the United States played out horribly in recent weeks, again, with Trump fanning the flames. I got a feeling that we're going to see acts of violence motivated by this idea that there's a global deep state run by Jews in a number of countries, perhaps including here in New Zealand, and certainly including Australia. So, and as you know, well, Selwyn knows, but David, the interesting thing in response to you yet again is that the intelligence services in question are now sharing information much better about right-wing extremism and are identifying. See, you may remember from a previous episode where Selwyn and I were discussing that until March 15th, right-wing extremism was treated as a domestic police problem. It was not considered a terrorism problem. And that happens in the United States, the UK, Germany, Australia. The security apparatus was looking for Islamicists. It was looking for Marxists. It wasn't looking for white extremists. And when it saw them, it said, oh, these guys are just a bunch of misfits and nutters. It's something for the police to deal with. Now we know that they are part of global extremist networks who plot and scheme across national boundaries. And that was clearly proven on March 15th here in New Zealand. So the good news is that this plot not only was disrupted on German soil, but will undoubtedly now lead to the uncovering of links between these plotters and their supporters or their emulators in other parts of the world.
Oh, that's excellent. So thank you for that, and thanks for the contributions that have come in from people that have been watching this while we're presenting our live program and recording this. We will be back this time next week, which is in New Zealand's context is midday on Thursday, and on the United States eastern side, that's around 6 p.m. on Wednesday evening. So we'll come back and we'll wrap up most likely next week, won't we, Paul, for the year, I'd imagine. And just looking at the dateline there. And we'll come back with a really good program and we'll hit it running. And I look forward to all of your company once again. Until that time, from Paul and I, ka kite anō, we'll see you again. Thank you again for your time.